Well, welcome this afternoon. I think we have a great panel for you that will certainly keep you awake after lunch. This panel is about the global education policy. And the reason this came about is really that USAID has been doing a, I think, remarkable job with its transformation initiative, and particularly in the education office with creating the new USG strategy and the education policy. They've done listening tours, listened to stakeholders, and really incorporated those comments in a really fascinating way. However, the SID event attracts 900 plus people. So it's a great opportunity to share that education policy to other sectors and really work together. I am very pleased that we have Daniel Runde, Senior Vice President, William Schreyer Chair, on Project on Prosperity and Development from CSIS, who also has great USAID credentials. Yeah. I won't tell you more.
It's all. Chair the SID board.
And used to chair the SID board.
Yeah.
And is ex officio SID still. But also has an illustrious USAID history, and all the bio is on the app, so we're going to be short. We're very lucky that Robert Burch, the Deputy Director of the Office of Education for USAID's Bureau of Economic Growth, Education, Environment, known fondly as E3, will be speaking. Beth Johnson, Director of Outreach and Communications at BEC, the Basic Education Coalition, and Laura Ripani, who is Principal Specialist, Labor Markets and Social Security Division, Inter-American Development Bank. Dan, I have encouraged you to be provocative, so take it away.
Oh my gosh, I don't know. I was going to be provocative, then I got feedback saying don't go too rogue, so I'm like trying to stay within the lines. But thanks, Ann. I feel like I'm working for Ann this week. I did something at ASU yesterday, and if you haven't been to the ASU building, I encourage you to go. It's beautiful, and I think ASU is a really tremendous institution. I'm a great admirer of the president of ASU, and he's had a fabulous book about the new American university that I encourage all of you to go out and read. I think this is a really interesting panel. I think this is a really relevant topic. We've done a number of things at CSIS. One is on innovation-led economic growth, and one of our theories is that the playbook that countries have used to escape poverty, working between education, business, and government, is going to have to be reset in sort of the changing technologies and sort of the game that's changing. We also did a year-long exercise, a task force or working group on the future of work. We looked at the issue of is everybody in poor countries going to lose their job to robots? Are the pathways out of poverty going to be blown up by technology? We looked at Kazakhstan. We did a case study in Kazakhstan, Nigeria, India, and Brazil, and we did 2 reports. My bumper sticker on it is not immediately are they going to get blown up, but that technology is changing the nature, certainly changing the nature of work, and that we're going to have a higher level of digital skilling and digital literacy as part of the future of work, and that many of the jobs that people who aren't born yet are going to be doing jobs that don't exist yet. And if I think about my career, there have been a number of jobs I've done in the last 20 years that didn't exist before I had it, and I suspect if you look at your careers, there are probably situations where you've done something that didn't exist before you did it. But it's going to be a lot more common. I think a couple of other points I'd make is that just because of demographics, there's going to be an increasing demand for just education in general. The other thing is, I think we ought to give ourselves a lot of credit. There's been sort of 30 or 35 years of significant effort by the aid community in particular, but also by host country governments who've also kind of gotten the memo that they need to be investing more in basic education. And so the world is, this ain't your grandparents' developing world. It's richer, freer, more capable, with more capacity and a lot more agency. And what I also tell folks who are running for president or policymakers is if we don't meet the hopes and aspirations of developing countries, they'll happily take their business to the Chinese. So I think that's something else for us to think about. But I would just make one other point, which is that we certainly need more higher education and more TVET, more vocational training. Those are, I think, going to be really important, especially in worlds of youth bulges. Not every part of the world has a youth bulge, but in places where there's going to be youth bulge, there's going to be an enormous demand Africa is going to have more people in 30 years than India and China combined. And so there's going to be an enormous demand for education and training, especially in places like Africa, but elsewhere. But we can't have all the skilling and all the AI stuff and all the building robots and all the STEM if people can't do basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. So with all of that, the context of this panel is global education policy around the world, the growing youth bulge, the employment gap, and the need for different skills. 21st century skills or power skills are all creating a wicked problem that needs to be addressed more systematically and in a holistic manner. And so I've got several kind of notional questions for the group, and I'm going to start with Robert Burch. Why don't you tell us a little bit, Robert, about the new basic education strategy and USAID education policy, and what's new and different, and how does that fit into this conversation? Thanks for being here.
Thank you. And many of you may know that the focus on education really has gone to higher within our own agency and within the development world. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the passage of the READ Act, or the Reinforcing Education Accountability in Development Act, or READ Act, which was passed and signed into law by the President in September of 2017. Immediately following that, USAID was named as the lead agency to develop a strategy for basic international education, which brought together 10 U.S. government agencies working in that area. So I think that has been a real step forward in terms of looking at how U.S. government agencies working in basic education can better coordinate the efforts in the field to be more efficient. At the same time, USAID developed its own basic education and higher education policy. And that policy is what helps guide a lot of the work that we are doing in the field. The policy is reflective of the new agency priorities that our administrator has seen, particularly in the role that education plays in providing a strong background for all students who are and all development that takes place in a country. So, for example, the administrator of USAID used this opportunity to highlight some of the priorities of the agency. For example, ensuring that we are collaborating very closely with our host country government counterparts, and ensuring that we hear what their priorities are, and ensuring that we are helping to set them on what he calls, what we are now referring to, the journey to self-reliance, meaning that they are moving away from the aid development dollars and funding and becoming self-reliant in their own right. We are also looking at ensuring that we're focused on a systems approach so that countries can take ownership of their own development as they move forward and we're not working in a project-based approach that we may have done previously, but looking at how do we transform the system so that our host country counterparts can take on this development. Local capacity building is another key aspect of the new education policy, which looks at ensuring that we have the capacity in the countries that we're working in to take on that role. Other highlights of the policy that make it somewhat different than some of the that in our previous work is that we are looking at non-traditional partners. How do we partner with the private sector better? And this is very much tied to some of the opening remarks that Daniel mentioned earlier, and looking at the changing technologies and the changing workforce. And we know that we really need to involve the private sector when we talk about providing workforce development training for youth in the countries that we're working in, because the private sector is the sector that is going to be hiring with jobs for these youth. We can't second guess what the private sector needs. They know best. So how do we leverage and partner with the private sector in developing our workforce development programs and higher education programs as we move into the future? Again, we are continuing to focus on learning. Many of you know that in the past, USAID has been very much focused on ensuring that all students by the end of grade 3 can read. We are expanding that to include focus on math, Also a focus on social-emotional learning and social-emotional skills, which we have also heard from the private sector are extremely important skills for students moving into the workforce. We're also continuing to look at how data drives decision-making. And finally, another highlight, which is very, very important, is we continue to promote equity and inclusion and ensure that all students, including those students that continue to be out of school or drop out of school, come back into the system.
Good. So, I mean, one of the things I think about is if you think about the workforce in developing countries, the World Bank has studies that say that 9 out of 10 jobs in developing countries are in the private sector. So I think this focus on how do you link education and training to participating in a workforce, I think is a very relevant focus. I do think we have education for a variety of other ends as well as training people, but I do think that is a central premise of why we should have my view is why we should be supporting education. This is great. Bethany, thanks for being here. You're with the Basic Education Coalition. There's a whole disparate set of partners that are brought together and are interested in international development and the Basic Education Coalition. Tell us about the Basic Education Coalition and tell us some about your partners.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Dan. And thank you to the panel organizers for having us. Really happy to be here. So my name is Beth Johnson. I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach for the Basic Education Coalition, and we have a few members in the room who I'm so happy to see. We have 23 very diverse organizations that make up our coalition membership, and they range in size and in focus. So some of them are the leading implementers for USAID education programs. Others are smaller and have a more specialized focus. But all of them are engaged in some way in education for development and committed to our mission to expand access to basic education for all children. Being part of a coalition, coming together to advance the greater good, is an opportunity for these organizations to drop their organizational affiliations. So a lot of the time they have to compete with each other to win grants and awards, and this is their opportunity to really talk to each other candidly about what's working, what their common challenges are. We listen to them and then communicate their recommendations back to Congress and the administration so that they can hopefully strengthen policy to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of US-funded international education programs. So our coalition was integral in the advocacy efforts around passage of the READ Act that Robert mentioned. We are so pleased to see that passed. It was actually September 8th, International Literacy Day of 2017. And now our current focus is on supporting USAID and the rollout of that strategy and the policy.
Great. Okay. Laura, thanks for doing this. I said I would only do this panel unless Laura Ripani was on this panel.
Thank you.
So Laura, you were on our Future of Work task force. I think you do some really interesting research at the Inter-American Development Bank. Are you technically a labor economist? Is that a way to describe what you do?
Yes, I am.
So I think there's been a lot of conversation about basic education, but a lot of your focus is how do people in various societies plug into labor economies, and how do they have the relevant skills to participate in the changing labor market? And so tell us a little bit about your work and tell us about the world that you're seeing out there, especially in the region of Latin America.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm so excited to be here. And I would like all of us to think why we are in this room today and why this panel exists. And it exists because the world of work is changing. Obviously, the technology is arriving at such a high speed. Automation is replacing many tasks that we did in the past, and now the robots are doing this work. The platform-based economy is creating new jobs, new opportunities for jobs, but also creating many risks for those that work in these platforms. So all of that make us think how the education and training system is going to adapt to that quick change that is happening around the world. So for us at the Inter-American Development Bank, we work with Latin America and the Caribbean. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have a very different way of thinking in terms of how technology is going to arrive, when it's going to arrive. It's going to arrive at a slower pace than in the US, for example. The costs of labor are much lower, for example, than in the US. So the cost-benefit analysis that employers do when they buy a machine is very different from the cost-benefit analysis that the US is doing. So the adoption of technology is slower, but it's coming. And it's going to affect workers in different ways. It's going to affect workers, especially those that are doing routinary work, especially those that have lower levels of education. So we are thinking strongly about how this is going to happen in our region in Latin America and the Caribbean, how countries in the developed world are dealing with these changes that are coming faster to those countries than in Latin America and the Caribbean, and seeing examples of how to make things better for the future of workers, right? And one thing that we are thinking is so crucial is trying to do this so-called lifelong learning system that connects education and training in a way that allows not only young kids and young people to get an education, but also adults that in many cases are like forgotten many times, especially in developed countries. They cannot get access or create to access training opportunities that they really need in these times of change. So for us, we need a skills development revolution in Latin America and the Caribbean. I think in other parts of the world it's also necessary. We need the resources for that. We need the actors, the private sector, the public sector, and also the individuals to change their minds, to be able to be flexible, adaptable, and get trained to be able to adapt to the new world of work.
Okay, so I want you to talk just a couple of points. So one of the things I want this audience to walk away from this conversation, not everyone's going to lose their job to robots. Is that right?
Right. Well, the studies say that this is tricky. 2 years ago, when I was in one of these conferences talking about this, I will give the example of the cashiers, the person working in the very basic kind of jobs, routinary. But artificial intelligence now combined with machine learning, deep learning, it's tricky now for other professions that are more skilled, right? For example, lawyers, for example, doctors, for example, people who is working in financial services. So many of the tasks that were performed in the past by many professions are going to be replaced. These are the more like routinary codifiable, but now it's getting a little bit trickier with all of these new technologies that are advancing. But for sure, one of the things that are not replaceable are the socio-emotional skills that were mentioned before. Communication, teamwork.
Creative thinking, critical
thinking. So there are many things that humans still have to do, right?
Right.
Working with robots, of course, because it's going to happen. We are going to work with robots. We already are working with robots, right?
Okay, but Laura, so there's a little bit of an assumption that we should have a straight STEM diet. We should have science, technology, engineering, math. And the way I hear the conversation, it seems as if everyone should just kind of double down on STEM. Is that an incorrect reading of it? We should have more STEM, but STEM isn't going to solve this problem.
So in my opinion, digital skills are going to be necessary for so many professions, right? So persons who have the ability to work in the digital world will have more opportunities. But then you have the creative economy, you have many other professions that are going to exist, and you don't need to specifically need the digital skills, and maybe the socio-emotional skills are going to be more important. For example, the care economy. So
what's the care economy, just so everyone understands what
so
that is?
In terms of also the demographic change, many countries in many regions in the world are getting older. So many people will have to take care of the older people,
Eastern
right?
Europe, China, parts of Southeast Asia, even.
Latin America and Caribbean.
Latin American and Caribbean, they're all going through global aging. So when we talk about the youth bulge, that's a Middle East, and that's an Africa thing. And it's somewhat an India thing, but even they're going to see some kind of slowdown over time, right?
Right. So the care economy is also a space where socio-emotional skills are going to be really well used. But at the same time, we have the professionalization of those professions or the qualification of those professions or the pay in these professions are still low. So we need to also work on training those individuals to work on that.
I want to bring in the other two folks, but I just want to ask you just a couple more things, because you can tell I really like your research, and I think you do some really interesting work. You did this interesting study with LinkedIn. Can you just talk a little bit about what was that study and what did you learn as a result of that study with LinkedIn?
Yeah, so with LinkedIn, we had a partnership to analyze the data on the 86 million users that they have in Latin America and the Caribbean, just to understand what are the most demanded skills in the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Because usually, if you rely on household surveys, you have limited data that to tell you the story about where we are going in this new economy, right? So we did this analysis, and it was interesting to know that from the 20 most demanded skills in Latin America and the Caribbean, 10 of them were digital skills. So their vision, even though we are going at a slower pace of adoption of technology, we are seeing in a higher or increasing demand in terms of digital skills. And we found out other stuff, but what I find interesting is that one crucial part of understanding how to change the education and training system is understanding the skills demands of the future. And we cannot use the data that we used to use in the past to understand the future, but we have to combine it with big data. So
Okay, great.
that was interesting.
Beth, please.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay, so given that we don't know what the workforce is going to look like or necessarily what the demands are going to be, our coalition has been advocating for many years, and we've been very happy to see a lot of traction gaining in the ground of early childhood education. And this is really important to build the foundation for lifelong learning, as you recommended, in the early years. So show of hands, is anyone in the room raising children between the ages of 0 and 5? Yes, okay, so wonderful. And I'm sure that you may already know or won't be surprised to hear that 90% of brain architecture is developed in the first 5 years of life, which means that humans learn how to receive, process, and produce new information. To just soak up that in the first early years. So we need to reach kids earlier and with better quality interventions. It's important that those are developmentally appropriate for children and that there's alignment between pre-primary and primary education so that it can continue throughout the school years and into the development of workforce skills. Conversely, if children don't receive early childhood education, they enter primary school not ready to learn that first grade curriculum, and it's very costly and inefficient, and it puts an incredible burden on early grades teachers that they have to instruct multi-levels of ability in that first and second grade level classrooms. So we were super happy to see in the new USAID education policy and in the whole of government strategy that early childhood education has finally become a priority, and we're looking forward to seeing how that pays off in the long term for different economies.
Great. Robert, how do you think about issues of foundational skills and social emotional skills in your strategy, and how does AID think about that?
Sure. Well, you know, one of the things that we have learned over the years is that access to education does not guarantee learning and improved learning outcomes. It doesn't mean that students who are enrolled in school are actually learning anything. Some of our initial assessments, for example, in early grade reading showed that in some countries, even after 2 years of schooling, children could not read a single word. And we know that the importance of education isn't simply getting children into the classroom, but ensuring that they learn those basic foundational skills.
So we've done a better job of getting butts in seats, but we haven't necessarily gotten folks to absorb the stuff.
In many of the places we work, I think that is exactly what's happened. And that's why USAID has had this very keen focus on ensuring that children learn to read in the early grades of their education. We also are ensuring that those basic foundational skills, along with social emotional skills, which is something that, as I mentioned earlier, is new to this, to our new policy and strategy, because we have seen how important those skills are later on. And again, going back to this lifelong learning, starting early with those social emotional skills really make a huge difference than if you're trying to introduce them to youth who have already gone through an elementary cycle. So all of those skills combine to help that student be successful through their education cycle. So building those social emotional learning skills as well as basic foundational skills to help students then use and apply those skills throughout their education cycle, eventually graduating and finding meaningful employment, therefore being able to contribute to and benefit from the economic growth and development of their own country, and actually taking on a lot of that development responsibility as they move into the workforce. So that is kind of how we have seen the role of that basic foundation, which is so important later on.
Could each of you talk about the issue of soft skills? I mean, there's so much discussion about learn to code and STEM, and I'm not against learning to code and STEM, but things like look somebody in the eye when you shake their hand, when if you say you're going to meet somebody for lunch, show up, send a thank you note, don't pick your nose in a meeting. I mean, basic, simple stuff that you know that we all in sort of highly sophisticated, highly educated societies operate as if that's kind of in the ether. But there's to function in a society, or things sometimes. Could you just each talk about this issue of soft skills and sort of and how, if I say the word soft skill, what's your reaction to that? How does that come across your radar screen? So I'll start with you, Robert.
Sure. So that's a great question. My last post before coming back to Washington was the Philippines. And in the Philippines, there was a lot of growth happening and taking place. But unfortunately, because of the skills gap, many of these new international companies who were coming in and setting up shop could not find enough employees to hire because they didn't have the right kind of skills that they were looking for. And in an assessment of what kind of skills are you looking for, surprisingly, it wasn't so much the very technical skills, but the soft skills. We want people who show up to work on time. We want people who are, engaging with the work that they're doing, asking questions. A lot of things that we sort of take for granted were exactly what we needed to actually teach directly to students in the country. So a lot of our programming really looked at how do you impart soft skills, social emotional learning, work readiness skills.
Emotional intelligence.
Emotional intelligence, the creative thinking, critical thinking, problem solving, all of that group of skills that are so important to employers.
Okay, soft skills, either of you?
Sure. Yeah, and I think that term soft skills is interesting because it makes it seem like they're kind of secondary to the curriculum and the standards that we're trying to teach to the students, but they're just as important, like what you said. I might even think of them more as essential skills, regardless of any job that you're going to take on in the future. We can also think of them as executive functioning skills.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it,
right?
executive
So,
functioning.
A lot of students in classrooms where teachers rely on rote memorization or chalk and talk, how they might just write something on the board and expect the students to copy it down in their notebooks, they're missing out on the opportunity for project-based learning and for themselves to investigate like complex problems and work in teams to solve those problems. If you go into a classroom in some developing countries, you'll just see them sitting silently in the classroom, listening to a teacher deliver a lecture, and it's not a student-centered classroom. You can tell when you walk in. So I think that it's really important to work with teachers to develop their student-centered instructional strategies. This is a complicated process, and it really requires that teachers receive appropriate levels of professional development and training, both in pre-service and in service throughout their careers.
Executive functioning, soft skills, life skills, whatever you want to call them, Laura. What's your take on that?
Well, one employer from a big hotel in Chile said this, hire for attitude, train for skills.
Hire for attitude, train for skills.
Yes. I
Good.
think it's a great phrase because many employers will give the technical skills that they need on training in the firm, but they need someone who brings already these socio-emotional skills, the soft skills, the attitude, to be able to learn at work, right? So I think, obviously, if you see the employer surveys, the manpower statistics and other statistics, you see that there is this so-called skills gap because many employers see that the socio-emotional skills actually are the ones that are most in need for their firms, and this is one of the things that they struggle with when they confront like opening a vacancy and trying to find workers. But the question is, for me, is how, and Beth was touching upon many things that we have to think about in terms of the education system. But I think, for example, for the training system, all of the training that is practical training in firms or in collaboration with the private sector, like apprenticeship programs, could bring or could help developing the socio-emotional skills that are necessary for the workforce. So I think the solution has to come with this practical training. If it is in the schools, like you said, problem solving in the classroom, touching things, working with things, so they can learn these soft skills, or in the firms, like it happens in Germany, Switzerland, but in other countries around the world that are working with apprenticeship programs.
So Laura, let me just push on that for a minute, because I think in this country, we've had an over-bias on university education. So we don't invest money in vocational technical training. It seems as if every marginal dollar goes to higher education, to say university education. I'm all for university education, but doesn't it mean that you have to make some choices in your society to say where you're going to put that marginal dollar? Because I think if you want to have a German-style vocational training, you actually have to invest in that, and you have to make some hard choices. Is that true?
Well, hard choices, you always have to make hard choices when it's a matter of money, where to put the money. But I think vocational and technical training in a world where you need a changing set of skills that cannot be developed only at the universities, it's getting more attention. I mean, at least in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Tibet systems are being rethought because we still need these technical skills. And these technical skills are changing more often, so short courses, certifications in different types of the practical training are necessary and are part of this. So that's why I say so-called lifelong learning system. Everybody talks about lifelong learning systems. Nobody knows how to do a lifelong learning system. But it's composed by universities, technical schools, small training.
Have elites overshot, Laura? Isn't it? There's a stigma in many societies, even in the poorest societies, to if you go to university, that's what we've all said you need to do. Now, I don't know. I think it's 35% of the American workforce is a graduate of a university. Maybe it's 40%. It's not 60%. Now, I think in this room, it's 100%, right? And so in the world that we all inhabit, it's 100%, or it's graduate degrees. But actually, in the rest of the country, it's not. So I wonder that, I have a family friend who's got 300 employees, and must be worth $50 million, and he is an elevator repair guy. Like, I don't think I think he went to Harvard University to repair the Harvard University elevators, but he didn't go to Harvard University. So, but I don't think if someone said as my life choice, I'm not going to go to university, I'm gonna learn how to repair elevators, I think we'd get kind of a mixed response in this room. I think everyone would all nod their head and say, I'm really supportive, and then they'd go back and say, why is my child doing this? So how do we deal with this issue of stigma having to do with not going to university education? Because I think that's a real thing. I don't think that's just in this country. I think even in a place like Afghanistan or in a place like Central America, I think that's a real thing.
Well, for me, it's a two-side story, right? You have the cultural part or the society part that is like not having this stigma in families, appreciating technical education, right? And then putting the money from the government side, the private sector side, on having a better technical education system. So it's attractive for students, for parents, so it's something that they are willing to do, right? So it's these two sides, the side of the society, but also the side of the public sector rethinking the technical education system. And I can give examples in Latin America. Brazil has a great technical education system. It has, it's appreciated. Many people want to go. Yeah. And in Argentina, it's not. So
we have... Mi hijo el doctor, right?
Sí,
mi hijo el doctor. In Argentina, my son the doctor.
My son the doctor, I'm from Argentina.
Right.
So my son the doctor.
I'm an honorary Argentine, as you know, right?
So In Argentina, we have different story from another neighbor country that is Brazil. But Brazil put a lot of money in the technical education system. So this has to change according to the times of change.
Okay, so do we need to have some Q&A, right? We have until 3:45? Okay, so you all been a really patient audience. I'd like, if people want to have cute questions, I think there's some microphones here. I've got plenty of questions for this panel, and I can keep talking to them all day long. But if people have Q&A, now's the moment for you all if you want to participate. Okay. Well, the silence is killing me. Okay, please come on down. Just say your name and who you're with, and yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been a great panel. Chloe Schwenke with the Association of Writers and Writing Programs. And you can guess where I'm going. There's been a lot of focus on reading as a skill, but not a mention of writing as a skill. And the importance of writing, as we sort of heard at lunchtime, to be able to express your culture, to express your social identity, to build a capacity to own pride in your human dignity, to actually cultivate an international readership, obviously in a globalized language like English, as not only a source of important outreach, but as a source of revenue, of livelihood. So while nobody can dispute the fact that STEM is important, we hear so little about education in the arts at any level, and in my context, focusing on education in the literary arts and the ability to give that a place in the total panoply of educational input.
Thank you very much. I want to put that in the parking lot. I want to get a couple more, because I want to push on the issue of education, the arts, and writing. I met with the Taiwan Minister of Culture last week, and if you look at the way they think about themselves, and that has a piece to it. So thank you very much. So, creative economy, writing, expression. So that we'll come back to that. And I also want you all to answer: is learning English a necessary life skill today in developing countries? My answer is yes. And I think we ought to own that. And so I'd like to get your reactions to that. Let's get some others here, please.
Hi, my name is Jamie Salazar, and I have a lot to say because I'm a product of two. I'm Colombian, and then I came and finished high school here in the United States. Something that I have seen, and also in development, is, at least in the case of Latin America, is working with the public sector to change curriculums and to provide practical experiences for students. That's something that I myself experienced, that we didn't have that much capacity to have practical experience, critical thinking, working in groups. So that's something that eventually helps you in the labor market. Yeah. So I was wondering if you have an example, especially in the IDB, working with a particular government to change that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, this woman here, and then Santiago, and this woman there. Let's get everybody. Yep.
Sure. My name is Jackie from AFSI Foundation, and it's kind of a big topic, but I'm just going to throw it out there, asking any quick thoughts on the issue of migration. So thinking about education in the future of work, how are you all thinking about migration, refugees?
Good. Sir.
Santiago Sedaka with Palladium. I am an Argentine, so
is this like
maybe
we're like having like a support
not,
group?
I don't know. One of the things as we run programs both in basic education, workforce development, skills, and so on. One of the things that I find in the conversations that I have with people in the development community within USAID, at the mission level in particular, is a lack of, I don't want to call it sophistication, but a lack of understanding that certain types of economies need more emphasis on certain types of education investments, and so other types of economies and situations require different types of investments. And just to kind of clarify or illustrate, there are economies where the basic education and a lot of the product of the programming around workforce development came out of the experience of Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, where people were well read and could essentially function very well, but they didn't know how to apply it. And there was a need for technical training, there was a need for soft skills. There are areas in Central America right now where we are working a great deal on dealing with this sort of unemployment because of lack of soft skills, okay? But then there are many other parts of the world where you really do need these basic education investments. And I just haven't seen any kind of like, if so, then what types of papers or typologies within USAID or within the development community that can help frame people, particularly missions as they develop strategies, so that they don't try to think about silver bullets to solve their economy's problems.
Good,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Let's hit this woman. This will be the last one. Please.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I know we touched lightly on the issue of getting butts in seats, but what inspired this question is I recently got back from northern Uganda a few weeks ago, and while I was pleasantly surprised to see that a lot of the rural villages had access to schools, during the school day, I also saw a lot of school-aged children working in fields, and it seems that those were in some of the poorest villages. So what's being done about the motivation to get some of the poorest families and parents to invest in their
incentivize
children's
them to,
education?
Yep. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to start with you, Robert. You don't have to answer all 5 of the questions or comments. Just pick a couple, and I'm hoping between the 3 of you, you'll be able to cover all of 5, and then I'm happy to take on the migration, refugees to the extent that's not covered by this group. Go ahead, Robert.
Let me address the question on curriculum because I think that's a really important point. Oftentimes, as we are working in countries, we are students in higher education institutions and also in some of the technical vocational schools are using a curriculum that is very, very, very outdated. It's no wonder that they can't find a job after they graduate because the curriculum they're using has probably been in use for 30, 40 years.
50.
And that's serious. Exactly. So we did something very, very interesting, I think, when I was in the Philippines. We are partnered with a group here in the United States of Philippine Americans, in an organization called PhilDev. Now, this is a group of Philippine Americans who have made it and made it big. Most of them live in the Silicon Valley. They're on the board at Berkeley, etc. They want to give back to their country. And they're all mainly focused in investment banking and entrepreneurship. So what we did, because of their connections with the government and also their connections with schools in the Silicon Valley, California area, we had them work with the government of the Philippines to completely revamp the engineering curriculum for the country. And in fact, it was adopted in 22 universities in the Philippines. And it has made a tremendous difference because it has revolutionized the way the teachers are teaching in those schools simply because of the curriculum, which really leads teaching.
Okay, great. Bethany. Beth.
Sure. Can I take the last question
Sure.
about why some students aren't going to school even when there are schools in the
please.
communities? Okay, and I want to harken back to my Peace Corps days to answer that question. So I lived in a rural village in West Africa that maybe is similar to wherever you went, your question is based in. And I was living with a family for 2 years. They had 6 children, and the first 5 had not attended formal school. Reasons are two main reasons. The first one is that there are a lot of hidden fees, even when a government says that they're offering free public education. A lot of the time, families are still responsible for purchasing school uniforms, books, a desk fee, exam fees, all kinds of things that can really add up and make it prohibitive. So it's not economically feasible. Secondly, the quality of education. It took me a long time to convince my host mother to send that last child to formal school. We walked over together to visit the school so that she would feel comfortable sending one of her children to be in the care of strangers. And when we got there, the headmaster was asleep at his desk. Okay, so this was devastating for me as someone who was trying to promote formal education. It was devastating for her as well because living as subsistence farmers, I had sold her on this idea that if you send your kid to school, they're going to have a hope for the future and a reason to stay in their community and be a leader of the next generation. We did it anyway. We enrolled her in school anyway, and this was 10 years ago. So now she's in 10th grade, and she's studying math and English, and she has dreams of being a doctor. So That's fabulous. That's a success story, but those are two of the reasons why the other 5 kids did not get to attend school, and hopefully something that we're addressing.
Okay. Laura?
Yes, I will take the question about the Colombia, the examples from Latin America and the Caribbean, where we incorporated soft skills in the education and training system. We first started with a youth training program for 16 to 29-year-old unemployed, or well, we call it ninis in Latin America, those who are not studying or working needs. And training them on socio-emotional skills. We selected a set of socio-emotional skills that they needed to have, and for sure, like the minimal, and had like an investment of 75 hours of this training. And what was interesting was that from this youth training program that was set for this specific group, it translated in getting this curriculum into the education system of secondary schools in the Dominican Republic, because they saw that it worked for the young people to have these games in the classroom. It was called the Happy Classroom, the curriculum. And they saw that it was working for this specific program, so they incorporated the lessons learned and the program into the secondary schools in the whole country. So I think it's a success story, because many times it's very difficult to approach the education system with these changes. But if you show that in the country is working, at least at the small level in some program, they can see that it works and incorporate it later on. So this is a happy story for me of this happy classroom. And then about this no silver bullets question, I think it's so important, right? Not to translate or to say this is how we should do it in all the countries, because it's not going to work, but, right? So at the IDB, we're thinking a lot about Legos. You know, the Lego Foundation or the Lego company.
Lego the toy.
Lego the toy,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And I'm a mother of a 3 and a 6-year-old, so I work with Legos all the time at home.
You're an investor. You're almost a shareholder in Lego.
Exactly. So we have to think about the system that is composed by different Legos, the foundational, the more sophisticated, and think how we can set up in this lifelong learning system different Legos, depending on the place, depending on the need. So first, having a diagnostic of what the country needs is essential to build the Legos up or down. Like.
Okay, let me put this to the group, because I want to come back to, there's arts and culture we didn't get to, and we didn't talk about migration. So I want to talk about this English issue. So we wrote a paper about English as the lingua franca. And it's in my interest that English remain the lingua franca. I don't want everyone learning Mandarin. I want everyone speaking English. So can I ask you each to talk about English as the necessary tool or skill set in the modern age? I would argue it is. What is your reaction to that? Robert?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I would say that employers are looking for English speakers, but I would also add that USAID is focused in the early grades on mother tongue languages, because we know research shows us that learning to read, initially learning to read in a language you speak and understand, is far easier than learning to read in a language you don't.
I agree with that. So I want people, before they walk out of here, just to say that I'm not saying they should learn English only, but I'm saying that if you want to escape the middle income country trap, if you're Brazil, they don't speak English very well. They have these metrics on sort of the quality of English. The quality of English in Brazil is terrible for what they need to do if they want to kind of transform their economy. So one of the missing links in a place like Ukraine, or one of the missing links in a place like Brazil, is actually having really strong English skills. And it's something that we need to kind of own, and it's actually a core building block today, and we need to be comfortable with that. Do you agree with that? Beth? Laura? Either of you? Say yes.
I believe that all students deserve to be taught in a language that they understand, at least in the early years. And beyond that, I think that it's important to consult with national governments and take into account what the national language is to be able to prepare students to compete for jobs.
Okay, Laura, English?
For me, I want to...
Dial 1 for English. Right.
No, I wanted to touch upon one of the big changes that I mentioned at the beginning, the freelancers economy, and the possibilities that this opens in terms of the different tasks that you can do for different countries in the world. And obviously, English is a super, super plus to work on Freelancers.com, on Upwork, or any other platform that is providing these opportunities. So for that, I think in terms of the countries in the developing world, having this skill will open many doors, especially in the future, because right now we are seeing like the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's going to happen with the freelancers or the gig economy.
Okay, let's talk about the creative and culture. So I think if you want to look at the innovation-led economic growth, if you look at, say, Taiwan, they have the video games, movies, the internet, the creative economy. I think a lot of it has to do with arts and writing. What do you all think about that?
I love it.
Hey, you buying
I'm
that?
a big user of that industry, right?
But isn't let's say in Latin America, aren't there a number of countries where culture or the creative economy is a growing part of the economy, even in some poor countries?
Yes,
right?
yes. The film, for example, the film
industry
is getting bigger and bigger in countries in Latin America, in Argentina, in Mexico, and you name it, like exporting talent in that sense. So I think it's a great industry. I'm an economist, so I'm on another side of the brain kind of thing. But I think it's super, super good for countries to invest in that. Countries in Africa are having this super, super, and India, obviously, has a super, super success story in terms of the creative industry. So I think for the developing region like Latin America and the Caribbean is a super, super fascinating area to work.
Writing, culture, arts, creative economy. Beth, Robert?
Sure. Okay, so when I was teaching special education in the Bay Area in California, I was at a mission-oriented high school where we wanted 100% of our students to all be accepted into four-year colleges and universities. So the main focus of the curriculum was on STEM, math, English included, engineering, technology. But we didn't have the capacity to deliver a comprehensive arts and culture program as well. And I think that a lot of my students would have benefited from greater opportunity to express their talents and discover their passions through more extracurricular activities. I think that everyone has differing talents and intellects, and it's important to have a comprehensive and holistic education so that all children can live their full potential.
Okay, Robert?
Sorry. The other thing about the question about being able to express yourself, and when I was teaching, we had a motto for all of my special education students that it was no decisions made about me without me. And part of that is being able to advocate for yourself and express your own needs and desires. And I think that that's still something that I try to live by today when I'm working with students and young people. And I was thinking about that in the context of the question in the panel description. Thinking about how when everyone's trying to work together to help the next generation to develop into the strongest workforce, there was a long list of who all of the different actors were in education, and it was donors, government, civil society, the private sector, how do we help them? But who's missing from that list? Students, yeah, students and parents. And I think that that's such an important and often missing component to a whole child's educational experience. So yeah, part of that is being able to express yourself, and certainly in writing that can be done.
Okay, Robert?
I would just add that, of course, literature and arts enhance any society, and I would say that USAID has not been focusing so much in that area simply because we have limited funding in what we can do. But I will say in all of the countries that I've worked in, I have just been amazed at some of the creativity and artistic creativity that you see there. So even though USAID may not be supporting that directly, it's happening, and it certainly does add to any culture.
Okay, on the issue of migration and refugees, we did a task force on migration and refugees. We spent a year looking at this issue. The magic number is 8,000. When a society hits $8,000 per capita, people stop migrating. So Mexico, what year did Mexico hit $8,000 per capita? 2005. So if you look at the there's now net migration. Folks are going back to Mexico from the United States when it hit $8,000 per capita. So one of the goals in my mind in a number of countries, say in the Northern Triangle, is how do we achieve 8,000? What are the sorts of policies that are going to be necessary to hit $8,000 per capita? Now we can quibble about that's kind of a broad brush thing, and there could be inequality in that, and so that's all true. But más o menos, just as sort of as a rule of thumb, use that. Just work with me. And so the point is that what do we need to do to have a growing economy, and then what do you need to have in terms of skills so that people can participate in that growing economy, I think is one thing. The second thing is, one of the things I worry about, and I know Administrator Green worries about, is there are something like 70 million internally displaced people and refugees today. It's the highest ever in human history, higher than in World War II. There are a lot of young people in that number, and some of them are not getting educated. And so what I worry about is how do we make sure that people in refugee camps, or who are not in refugee camps, who are living in rural communities or cities who have been displaced, are they getting educated? Because it's not only the sort of thing that's important from a development standpoint, it's a national security, it could be a national security problem, frankly. So on that note, I know we need to end it, but thank you very much, Ann, and thank you all for being here. Please join me in thanking the panel.